Hello and welcome back to Chapter 28. I hope you enjoyed the part one of Chapter 28, where we went through a lot of different slides and a lot of different material, really introducing us to this large, diverse group with a lot of variety of different lifestyles. Some are photosynthetic, some are heterotrophic, so a lot of varieties of different types of ways of obtaining nutrition and things like that, and shapes and sizes and colors. And so we're going to continue on then. And remember that in part one, we stopped at this slide here, slide 52, showing the different parts of. Do you remember what this was, by the way? In way of review, do you remember what group this thing is from? It looks kind of brownish, right? And it's obviously multicellular, right? Well, this is, if you guess brown algae, you'd be right. It's brown algae. So kind of interesting. So the blade is the photosynthetic part, and then the stipe is kind of like a stem, and the holdfast is something analogous to like a root of a plant, for example. But remember, these are not plants because they don't have complex organs and tissues like plants do. And also, the makeup of the cells are more like protists rather than plants. But anyway, so now we're going to look at a phenomenon in the brown algae and in other groups, phenomenon called alternation of generations, which means they basically alternate between two different forms. And so it's kind of an interesting life cycle. The most complex life cycles amongst the protists include this alternation of generations. And so because there's two different alternate forms, that's why they call it alternation, because there's two alternate forms then, or two alternative forms, you could say. And basically, they alternate between a haploid generation and a diploid generation. Do you remember what haploid and diploid mean? Because we covered that in Biology 1. Haploid means having just one chromosome from each chromosome pair, and diploid means having two chromosomes from each chromosome pair. And remember, we're talking about eukaryote chromosomes and eukaryotic cells here. So some species have heteromorphic. So now, remember, what does hetero mean then? Remember what hetero means? Like heterozygous or something. Hetero means other. And morph, what does morph mean? We've covered that term and encountered the term morph quite a bit already in this semester, in this course. Morph means form. Oops, excuse me. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So basically, other form. In other words, other in this sense means different. And so basically, some species have heteromorphic, in other words, structurally different generations, so that the haploid generation and the diploid generation have a different form and a different structure from each other, a different anatomical structure from each other. But others have isomorphic forms. And what does iso mean? Do you know what iso means? Iso, like an isosceles triangle. What is an isosceles triangle? An isosceles triangle, basically, isosceles triangle is a triangle where all sides are equal length, and iso means equal. So isosceles triangle is a triangle of equal length. So anyway, or if you do isometric exercises, the body part is not moving. It maintains an equal length throughout the exercise. But anyway, so isomorphic, iso means equal. So equal or the same, and morph means form then. So they have the same structure, same form. So in some species, they're heteromorphic, and the haploid and diploid generations have very different anatomy. But in others, the haploid and diploid generations have basically very similar anatomy or the same anatomy. And we'll see that they take the same form. So in all of these life cycles that have alternation of generations, the diploid generation is called the sporophyte because they produce spores. And phyte actually means plant. And so these are plant-like. They look like a plant, and so phyte actually means plant. Like phytoplankton, plankton that are plant-like. So the sporophyte, they call it. So the diploid generation is called a sporophyte because it produces spores, and the haploid generation is called a gametophyte because it produces gametes. The sporophyte produces haploid spore. So the sporophyte is diploid, but it produces haploid spores that'll give rise to the next generation, which is haploid. And the haploid spores are called zoospores. And zoo means animal. Zoo or zoa means animal. So they're called zoospores in the brown alga laminaria. Almost sounds like the word laminate, laminaria. Spores develop into multicellular haploid male and female gametophytes, and the gametophytes produce gametes. That's why they're called gametophytes. And fertilization of the gametes results in diploid zygote. So basically these gametophytes. So the sporophytes produce haploid spores, and the gametophytes are producing haploid gametes, even though they don't really say that here. But we could just add that in. So whether they're producing spores or gametes, they're always haploid. But these haploid gametes join together and fertilize one another, and so they join. When they join together, they join their chromosomes together, and they produce a diploid zygote. Then, and remember, the zygote is the first cell of a eukaryote multicellular individual. And so that zygote eventually grows and goes through embryonic development and everything, and produces a new sporophyte, and then you just start the process over again, the cycle over again. And let's look at the cycle in a diagram. So here's a nice sporophyte that's diploid, so they call it 2N, and it has structures in it called sporangia that produce the spores. And so the spores are produced on the blades then. So basically the sporophyte produces spores, and the spores go through meiosis to produce haploid zoospores. And these haploid zoospores, they produce male and female gametophytes that are haploid. And the male and female gametophytes produce gametes, haploid gametes. So the female gametophyte produces an egg. The male gametophyte produces haploid sperm, and then the egg and sperm, basically the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then after fertilization that produces a zygote, and the zygote initially is just a part of the structure of this female gametophyte, but then it develops into a sporophyte, and eventually that sporophyte breaks off and becomes an independent sporophyte individual living on its own that produces spores, and you go through the whole process again. So it's kind of an interesting alternation of generations here then. So there's a gametophyte generation, there's a sporophyte generation, and it's an interesting life cycle. And here's another shot of another type of brown algae. That's probably the laminaria, I suppose. Yeah, that's the laminaria. Now there's another group then in this SRA. There's another group called the alveolates, and they have membrane enclosed sacs. They're called alveoli. And you may, if you've ever studied anatomy, physiology, or anything, in our lungs are filled with millions of membrane enclosed sacs called alveoli, and that's where the oxygen from the air diffuses into the blood in the capillaries, and where carbon dioxide in the capillaries diffuse out into the air in the alveoli. So little sacs that are enclosed by a membrane are called alveoli, whether they're in these protists or whether they're in the lungs of animals. And these sacs are just under the plasma membrane, and we'll see those in a minute. They include, just these alveolates then include dinoflagellates, apicomplexans, and ciliates. And so here's an alveolate, kind of a typical alveolate. Here's what the cell looks like. And if you look right here where the flagella hooks onto the cell, you can see that there are sacs, membrane-bound sacs. The alveoli are right here, and they're on this species. They're right here at one end of the cell. Here's another close-up again of that. And so there we go. So now here are the dinoflagellates then that are a type of alveolate. The dinoflagellates have two flagella, and each cell is reinforced by cellulose plates on the outside, and there can be large numbers of dinoflagellates then in the ocean and also in fresh water. And there's a lot of variety amongst them. They can be phototrophs, mixotrophs, or heterotrophs. And I don't know if you've ever heard of red tides out in the ocean, but red tides where the water turns kind of red, they're caused by red dinoflagellates. And a dinoflagellate bloom, again, here's that word bloom again. It just means an exponential increase in the population numbers. And so, this little dinoflagellate then, it looks kind of yellow in this photograph, but it's actually kind of a reddish color, and it produces a red tide, for example, in the Gulf of Carpentaria near northern Australia. But the red tides, can be seen off the coast of eastern United States, like the Carolinas or Florida or something. I think typically during the summer, here's a good look at it again, and the red tide. Lots of good slides. Here's a video of dinoflagellates and how they move, and they can move rather quickly with those two flagella. Then they can make good use of those flagella. Moving all around. Doesn't really seem to have a flexible body like a euglenoid, though. You can see kind of a groove along here, along the near the middle or the equator of the cell, and up here, here's what that groove looks like, really clearly presented in a scanning electron microscope photograph. So good videos then. So now let's look a little bit at the apicomplexans then, another type of alveolate. So apicomplexans are parasites of animals, and some cause serious diseases in humans or animals. And they spread through the host as infectious cells called sporozoites. Zoites mean they're kind of animal-like. The one end of the sporozoite, called the apex of it, contains complex organelles specialized for penetrating host cells. So the apex has specialized organs. That's why they're called apicomplexans, because the apex of the cell has specialized organelles for penetrating host cells and tissues. And they have a kind of a life cycle as well. And they have sexual and asexual stages, and require 2 or more hosts in different stages of their life cycle. So kind of an interesting complex life cycle. And then the apicomplexan called Plasmodium, the genus Plasmodium, then has a few different species in it. So all of them of the apicomplexan genus Plasmodium are parasites that cause malaria, either in humans or animals. And Plasmodium requires both mosquitoes and humans to complete the whole life cycle. And about 200 million people worldwide, mostly in the tropics, are infected at any one time, and about 600,000 people die every year of malaria. So, malaria is still, sometimes in this country we think, well, the major disease nowadays is like heart disease or cholesterol or something, but no, worldwide the major disease though are still these diseases that have plagued us for thousands of years, like malaria or cholera or sleeping sickness caused by the trypanosomes, or things like that. So the first malarial vaccine actually took quite a while to really develop, but the first malarial vaccine, anti-malaria vaccine, was approved in Europe in 2015, but it's only giving partial protection for malaria. But there are still ongoing efforts though to develop an effective vaccine against malaria. But the malaria can change quite quickly though, and that makes it hard to develop a vaccine against it. So a mosquito bites a person or an animal. You can see the apex of the apicomplexan with specialized organs. So the mosquito bites a person. The merozoites get into the blood, and they go through the blood and they circulate through the blood. And when they get to the liver, they get into liver cells, and they grow inside the liver cells and then burst out, kind of like a bacteria does in a cell. So they grow in there and burst out. And then when these merozoites that are produced, then during this time of the life cycle, they go into red blood cells and they infect red blood cells. And then when they burst out of the red blood cells, they're gametocytes. And these gametocytes could be picked up in the blood by another mosquito that happens to bite the person at that time, when there's a lot of gametocytes in the blood. And then the gametocytes do development inside the mosquito's body, and male and female are produced, and they fertilize each other, produce a zygote, and the zygote then produces oocytes, and the oocytes are inside the mosquito. And those oocytes actually, they don't really mention that here in the PowerPoint, but these oocytes actually produce sporozoites, and the sporozoites go from the digestive system of the mosquito to the salivary glands of the mosquito. Once they're in the salivary glands of the mosquito, they can be transmitted to another host whenever the mosquito bites another host. So that's a very quick rundown of kind of a very interesting, very fascinating, very complex life cycle of this Plasmodium that is a type of apicomplexan. Then, so here you see some close-up. Here's a close-up of the merozoite. Really interesting looking cell there, invading a red blood cell. So interesting stuff. So that then, those are the apicomplexans. Now look at the ciliates. This is the last type of alveolate. The ciliates then it's a large varied group, and they're named because they use cilia to move and feed. And most of them are predators of bacteria or other protists. And cilia are molecularly pretty much the same as flagella. The only difference between cilia is that usually a cell has more cilia than flagella. And also cilia are usually shorter than flagella. And we'll probably see some pictures. So one of the features of this group is that there is the presence of two types of nuclei, tiny micronuclei and large macronuclei. So, micro means small, generally means small, and macro generally means large. Like macroeconomics is studying economics on a large scale economics, like economies of whole countries and things. So macro means large scale. So genetic variation then results from conjugation, in which two individuals exchange haploid micronuclei. Kind of like what prokaryotes do. And so conjugation is a sexual process because they're exchanging chromosomes and exchanging genetic material. But it's a sexual process that's separate from actual reproduction. They're just exchanging micronuclei. They're not actually producing a new generation. When reproduction takes place, it's usually by binary fission, so like an asexual type of reproduction. It's kind of like a mitosis, where one cell just produces two new daughter cells that are pretty much the same as the original cell. And so here are cilia that are covering this cell, and here's a micronucleus and a macronucleus. You can see that cilia are present in larger numbers than flagella, and they're also shorter than flagella. And so here's a life cycle where it goes through meiosis to reproduce, meiosis to exchange genetic material with another individual, and then it goes through fusion to actually produce new individuals then. And so it's a really interesting life cycle. And this is Paramecium caudatum, one of the most common paramecia then amongst the protists. Here's some up close pictures of the life cycle. And here's the actual picture of the paramecium under the microscope. Very good photo. And this is a nice video showing how they move. You can see the cilia beating back and forth here very actively. Here's the oral groove where it takes in food. Really interesting stuff. Then another video, and you can see the cilia better on this video. You can see this kind of turning and twisting as it goes through the water. You can see the beating of the cilia if you look closely. So kind of an interesting video. I wonder if does this do well when it, you kind of, if you make it larger, it kind of loses a little bit of its picture quality, but not too much though, not too bad. Anyway, nice video. Another video of Vorticella, and they also have cilia. They have cilia at one end of the cell. Kind of interesting stuff. You can watch those videos then. And here's a detail of Vorticella habitat, another video. And so now let's look at rhizarians. What are the rhizarians then? The rhizarians are the R then of the SAR group. A lot of species of rhizarians are amoebas. You may have heard of amoebas then. Amoebas are protists that move and feed by things called pseudopodia, which pseudo is false and podia is foot, so kind of a false foot. But they move and feed using pseudopodia, and we'll see that in just a minute here. Rhizarian amoebas differ from amoebas in other groups because they can have thread-like pseudopodia. And these rhizarians include three different groups: radiolarians, forams, and sometimes they call these foraminiferans rather than forams. And then cercozoans. So they're mostly in oceans then. They have delicate and symmetrical internal skeletons, cytoskeletons, generally made of silica, which is kind of interesting. The pseudopodia are reinforced by really small microtubules, and they radiate from the central body of the radiolarian. And it's cytoplasm covering the microtubules engulf or surround prey that become attached to the pseudopodia. And you can see here's pseudopodia, different pseudopodia from this radiolarian. So the foraminiferans, or forams for short, are named for a porous shell. Porous means it's got little pores, little openings. A porous shell is called tests. And they have pseudopodia that extend through the pores in that very tough, unyielding shell, and they go into, and they're used for swimming, for forming the test, and for feeding as well. Some also do photosynthesis to get extra energy. And the photosynthesis is formed by symbiotic algae that are living inside the tests. So they take in renters, I guess. So, and they can be both freshwater or marine. And a lot of foram tests then in the sediments in marine areas then are extensive parts of the fossil record. So in certain geological strata or layers in the earth, there's a lot of forams there, and some of these forams actually are in the same geological layers as oil. And so when they do oil exploration, they like to look for what type of forams are there, because that'll indicate whether or not there's a good chance that there's oil in certain areas then. And so some researchers, they can use measures of magnesium content in the forams to estimate changes in ocean temperature over time. And here you can see, fossil forams then. Very small, anyway. Then the cercozoans are a large group. They're amoeboid, so amoeba-like. So there are some that are amoeboid and some that are flagellated. And they have thread-like pseudopodia as well. They're either marine, freshwater, or even in soil. And most are heterotrophs. And usually a lot of them are then parasites or predators. And then the Pollinella chromatophora is a cercozoan autotroph with a unique photosynthetic structure called a chromatophore, and it evolved from different cyanobacteria than the plastids of the photosynthetic eukaryotes. That's what they're figuring then. And here you can see that chromatophore then in the cell. And red algae, look at red algae and green algae. Closest relatives of plants. And so plastids arose from cyanobacterial endosymbionts, and they may have evolved then into red and green algae. And they think maybe the plants might be actually descendants from green algae then, because they have some of the same type of photosynthetic pigments then. Archaeoplastida is a subgroup that includes red algae, green algae, and also plants. You can see, so here's the Archaeoplastida then. So the red algae then, they have a reddish color because of accessory pigment called phycoerythrin. that that masks the green chlorophyll. So it does have green chlorophyll, but it has a lot more of the red phycoerythrin, so that it looks red. The color can vary somewhat. They're usually multicellular, and they could be the largest seaweeds in some areas, and they're most abundant. They are the most abundant large algae along the coasts. And you can see, a variety of different types, and some of them are used nori, the Japanese word nori for seaweed, and they can be harvested and put into flat sheets and be used for Japanese food. And here's some. Here they are being raised commercially in large numbers and producing lots of delicious types of foods. But anyway, so that's the red algae. I think, though, that we'll stop at this point then. And on part 3, the last part of this series on chapter 28, part 3 will begin right away with the green algae. So as always, let me know if you have any questions or anything, and be sure to daily check your email and your Canvas for announcements for this and other classes. Thank you, and goodbye for now. We'll see you later.